family actually, excuse me, sorry about that, I switched off. Jim's family first settled in the Yarra Valley in 1840, and at that time, they established very close relationships with the local Aboriginal people, and these relationships have endured through generations. Jim himself has actually a lifetime of involvement in Aboriginal affairs, and in fact has written some 100 books and articles on Aboriginal history and heritage. Jim's understanding, therefore, do not come from abstract academic study, but from his family's and his own lived experience. So this morning, Jim will discuss the issues of disease, dispossession, dislocation and dispersal that accompanied British colonisation in Australia from 1788, and which has led to ongoing problems of discrimination and disadvantage across the generations. Truth-telling as a means of moving forward as a united Australian people will then be explored. So please welcome Jim. Seem to have gone silent here. I can't.
Jim, you will need to unmute.
Oh, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's Jim. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, somebody else has just entered the waiting room. Anyway, at school, we all studied British history as a subject. I remember in primary school, the teacher standing up with a globe of the world on it, with all the countries in the British Empire coloured in red: New Zealand, Australia, India, South Africa, Canada, and he spun it around and said that the world never set, the sun never set on the British Empire. And we were given this idea that the British Empire was a force for good. And May 24th each year was Empire Day, and we light bonfires and set off crackers and all that sort of stuff. So, and the Australian history we were taught was from a British perspective. And we all know the old adage, winners write history. So there was this slant always to it, and we never really got any aspect of Aboriginal history apart from pigeonholing them as simple, primitive, pagan, wandering nomads. And but we need to incorporate an Aboriginal perspective into our shared history. We're Australians. We're not displaced English people, as lots of people over the last couple of hundred years have thought of themselves. And Aboriginal people have really been missed out. So Yoo-rrook, the Truth and Justice Commission, is a long overdue attempt to realign our history. But there's problems attached with this, and there's been attempts by some to impute some sort of racial guilt, that white people are somehow responsible for the oppression of black people. I'm not going to go all of this, but the whole idea of racial guilt is wrong and counterproductive. We need to understand the unembellished truth. And we can't take either credit or blame for whatever good or evil our forebears might have done. We're only responsible for what we do in our own lifetime. And we need to address this as Australians together. So what I'd like to do today is review some of the truths I know about, and truths that have too often been hidden from us. And then I'd be happy to take some questions. But I'll start off really with the biggest hidden truth by far, and that's the smallpox plague of 1789. And I researched this for a number of years, and Aboriginal people were saying to me, surely it was deliberate. And I said, well, I can't find any evidence. But then I suddenly cracked the case. The First Fleet was the most documented event in human history. everybody was writing letters and reports, and a couple of people had book deals before they even left on the First Fleet. So everything was documented, and sorting through. Fortunately, my training is in forensic social work. In other words, I look at criminal situations and track down what happened. And one of the prime techniques of that is collecting dates. All you do is collect dates, and then you seriate them, and you don't accept that there's such a thing as coincidence. You explore. And of course, there's plenty of dates available when you look at all the First Fleet documentation. I won't take you at all through it, but I struck a difficulty in it. It finally, some history books said no white man died in the smallpox plague of 1789. And then other history books said one sailor from the First Fleet died. So I thought I'd better really track down. And when I got down to the passenger lists of the First Fleet, what I found out was both things were true. And the one sailor who did die was not a white man. He was an American Red Indian. And then I knew the answer, because Aboriginal Australians and American Indians get on famously with each other. They have the same sort of totemic understandings, the same sort of behavioural protocols. So when I looked at, I found that what had happened is that the doctor on the First Fleet, John White, had been with the British Navy and studied smallpox all over the world with the British Navy, West Indies, India, all around. And he got appointed to the First Fleet. He came late and didn't have time to buy bottles of smallpox scabs to immunise people with. And so they left England, and the fleet then stopped over at Rio de Janeiro. And this is where Joseph Jeffries, the American Indian, was recruited to the First Fleet. And then they called into South Africa, to Cape Town. And this is where John White bought a number of bottles of smallpox scabs. And this is recorded in the First Fleet. Watkin Tench, who was on the same ship as White, said that they bought bottles of jars of smallpox scabs in South Africa. So the First Fleet arrived in Australia, as you know, January 1788. And then 15 months later, in April 1789, all of a sudden smallpox broke out. And people saying, what happened? And people have invented fanciful scenarios. They said, oh, the French did it, but that was quite impossible. They said, oh, Macassan fishermen in the Northern Territory who used to go there every wet season, they introduced it. That's quite impossible. It could not have possibly travelled in the 3-month allowed the 4,000 kilometres with the incubations that were required. Quite impossible. Some other people said, oh, it was chicken pox, not smallpox. That's rubbish, because chicken pox and smallpox had been differentially diagnosed for 20 years, different sorts of rats, all that sort of stuff. But what I found out was when Joseph Jeffries died of smallpox, no surprise was expressed. Now, nobody was allowed to go outside the Sydney Cove without permission of one person, and that was Captain James Campbell. So obviously, because no surprise was expected that he'd caught smallpox visiting the Aboriginal people, what was obviously happened that he'd had permission from Campbell. Now, Campbell's immediate superior was the Lieutenant Governor, Major Robert Ross, who'd had these arguments with Phillip, and they hated each other. And when I looked at the letters patent of both the Governor, Phillip, and Lieutenant Governor Ross, it was obvious what had happened is that they'd given, Phillip was a great man, a man of the Enlightenment, and the letters patent said, treat the natives with amity and all the rights of British citizenship. But Ross's letters patent, gave him superiority over Philip in matters of war. And within 6 months, they were all starving at First Fleet, and they were running out of ammunition. Attacks by the natives were increasing, and then all of a sudden, the smallpox came. And to cut the long story short, Ross and Campbell had served together in the American Indian Wars from 1763 to 1765, then in the American Revolutionary Wars from 1775 to 83. And in both those wars, Britain had used smallpox as a biological weapon. And this is proven. And I've dug up all the letters from General Amherst saying we need to extirpate this execrable race by any means at hand. And then Colonel Bouquet said, I will distribute, get blankets, distribute. I will infect the blankets and make sure that I don't infect myself doing. In other words, he knew to wear gloves. So all this is recorded. And so Ross and Campbell knew what to do because they'd been involved with General Amherst in previous occasions. Now, what happened is that John White's storekeeper, who kept the medical supplies and obviously kept the jars of smallpox scabs, got promoted to be storekeeper at the new store at Parramatta and placed all the smallpox jars in the government store. Then they found out that that a number of the Marines had been robbing the store. And so Ross and Campbell did an audit and found the jars of smallpox scabs. Then they knew what to do. All they had to do, they knew that Joseph Jeffries had made friends with the local people. All they had to do was to give him the the infected clothing and blanket. And that's what happened. And the smallpox plague broke out. It was first observed on the 15th of April, 1789. And there's graphic accounts, and it spread all over Australia. And Aboriginal oral history shows that this is so, because in Victoria, there's the legend of the Mindai. And what I found interesting is when I presented this, I've done research into the population base, and there's current research that says the population of Australia was at least 3 million people. And smallpox, when it's introduced to naive populations, kills 80 to 90% of the population. So therefore, if there's 3 million people, 2.5 million Australians were killed by smallpox. And what's interesting is that the arguments that historians place, trying to minimise the impact. So I know there was only 1 million people and it was only 50%. So what? The point is, if it was 1 million people and half died, that's 500,000 Australians died in the smallpox plague. Well, you know, and people seem to say, well, let's delete, decrease the amount so that the horror is not as great, and make up all these fanciful stories. So there's still wrote a book called The Dust of the Mindai, and the Mindai is the Yoo-rrook legend of the disease. And I wrote it 6 years ago, and it's hardly had any traction at all. Nobody is really taking the issue up. As I said, this is the biggest of the truths that need to come out, and people need to accept that this is what happened. Major Robert Ross was the most evil man in Australian history. Anyway, what happened after that is that there were a series of military exercises against Aboriginal people in the colonisation of Australia. So Sydney was occupied, and then we all were told when we were going to school that Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth found the way over the Blue Mountains. It's not mentioned that 2 Aboriginal guides showed them the song line to go through the Blue Mountains and to get into the land beyond the mountains. Anyway, that was opened up to settlement. And we're not told about the Bathurst War that went for the best part of a year. In January 1824, Governor Brisbane declared martial law, and that it ended up in a final Battle of Bathurst in September 1824, when a lot of Aboriginal people were slaughtered. And all these deaths are dialed down in history, and saying, oh, it's disputed and that sort of stuff. So anyway, the Bathurst War went on for the best part of a year. Then the colony in Tasmania was opened up, and we know more about what happened in Tasmania because Governor Arthur declared martial law in November 1828. And this was in relation to Aboriginal reprisals. Aboriginal women were being raped and people were being, all sorts of outrages were happening. And because Aboriginal people were fighting back, Governor Arthur declared martial law. We've heard something of the Black Line. They tried to, but people don't know much about that. On one occasion, 200 Aboriginal people were herded onto a cliff and made to jump. Now we've just learned recently that John Batman was involved in a massacre, and it said 15 people. Well, if it said 15 people, you can double that at least. Anyway, Victoria started to be settled by the Henty family in 1834, but before that, sealers and whalers had been camping along the coast in Western District, and there was the Convincing Ground massacre in July 1834, which started the Yoo-rrook War. And I don't know whether anybody would have ever heard of the Yoo-rrook War, but it went for about 18 years, and it only ended with a final massacre of the Gunditj Mara at Lake Condah in 1852. Now, in Victoria, a native police force was set up, and the ostensive idea was to help civilise and Christianise the natives in the force. Would learn to report to work on time, all that sort of stuff. But what they also learnt was heavy drinking at the end of the day. But anyway, there was a hidden agenda, and the native police force were deployed in October 1842 down to the Western District to support the border police. Now, the border police was just a ragtag bunch of people, ex-convicts who had been pardoned, ex-convicts with military service, who'd been pardoned on the basis of becoming part of this police force. And all it was a force to massacre Aboriginal people. Now, in November 1842, the native police were involved with the border police in a massacre at Portland, and one Aboriginal leader from Melbourne, Muni Muni, was responsible for killing 7 on his own. And this is why Billy Valeri, the leader, walked off and refused to have anything more to do. He had patronised the native police before that. So, and then Angus McMillan, who was an early explorer of the Gippsland region, he went on had a massacre near Sale in 1843, and at least 200 to 500 people were killed in a series of massacres in Gippsland. Now, in Gippsland, Angus McMillan is taken as a hero pioneer, and there are at least 6 statues to him, and yet he was involved for these massacres. Now, people say, "Oh, tear down the statues." No, we shouldn't be tearing them down. We should be using them as a vehicle to explain our full history and say, well, Angus McMillan was one of the greatest criminals that we've had, and we should explain these sorts of things that happen and bring it into people's consciousness. So there were massacres all over Australia, in all the states, right up until the 1930s in the Northern Territory and in the north of Western Australia. There were, you know, outrages happening all the time there. Now, this is not just a matter of massacres and wrongdoing. Aboriginal people were dispossessed, displaced, and their social fabric was destroyed. Probably the worst destruction of social fabric was by the smallpox plague, where there ended up being less women than men, and a gap in the generational profiles. And so all their planning, marital planning, went out the window, and wife stealing came into vogue, and that meant that intertribal conflict increased in an extraordinary way that had never been seen before. In other words, Aboriginal people were killing Aboriginal people because of the breakdown in their social fabric. And what has been, there's been a lot of publicity about the stolen generations, but the thing to understand about the stolen generations is that this was a product of breakdown in the social fabric of Aboriginal society because of the impacts of colonisation and dispossession. And so it was seen as an exercise in saving children rather than providing supports. Now, I was in 1980, I was delegated by the Department of Social Security, who was my employer at the time, to do a review of the Aboriginal childcare services in the state. And I went around the whole state and looked at, and found that there was caring networks. Aboriginal people were looking after children that were not biologically their own, you know, that kids would live with Auntie Pat if mum and dad were not doing well or looking after them. And what I suggested to the government was that that the services should focus on strengthening the fabric of the Aboriginal community, finding these people who are doing caring tasks and supporting them. But my report ended up getting thrown out, so it didn't matter. But the point that I'm saying is that we need to look at, you know, some people point out and say, oh, there weren't any stolen generations. Technically, that's not true, but children were put into the care of the welfare because of the breakdown of the social fabric. And then it became victim blaming, you know, the saying that, oh, well, we were saving the children. Anyway, that's the sort of context that the Yoo-rrook Truth and Justice Commission needs to look at all these things so that we can all understand as Australians where we've been and where we need to go in the future. My only concern is that sometimes you end up having these situations kidnapped by people with strong ideological views of the world and trying to foist racial guilt onto us. And I think that's what we need to avoid at all costs. Anyway, that's perhaps I'll just open it up to any questions that people might like to ask.
Can I just say there are a number of people where perhaps you have your video switched off by choice there, but I don't know if people have dropped out or perhaps have the video off, so I can't see everybody. So yes, Andrew, and yes, well, the name is Andrew here. Yes, go ahead.
Jim, what's your feeling about the Uluru Statement from the heart and where we should go with that now?
Yes, I believe that we need to have truth-telling. What I don't believe in that there's been sufficient discussion about the idea of a voice to Parliament and things like that. It's far more complicated. The Aboriginal community itself needs to do a lot of work on coming together. There's enormous kinship rivalries and all this sort of stuff that permeate the community. And this is, part of the result of the destruction of social fabric. It's almost like a Stockholm syndrome, So Aboriginal people need to do a lot of work on getting their act together. And what's being done in Victoria with setting up, what do we call it? It's the First Peoples Assembly, and the process that they'll be. It's going to be a 5-year process, just simply to get the Aboriginal community thinking along similar lines, and also there's important structural questions. I suppose, to cut it short, what I suggested that the approach should be taken at an Australian level is that we should a couple of principles embedded in the Constitution saying what sort of society we are, a plural democratic society with equality under the rule of law, and also recognising that our Aboriginal history and culture is an important part of our identity, and that should be enshrined as a principle, because there's too many. If we go too quickly, it'll just blow up in our faces and people won't agree. So this is a 10-year discussion we need to have before we finally get to an agreement on what sort of mechanisms are the best. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Rosemary, go ahead.
I'm intrigued by the statement that there were fewer Aboriginal women left after the smallpox epidemic. Were women more susceptible to smallpox?
The people that were most susceptible for smallpox is if you were over 60, you were dead for sure. If you were under 6, you were dead for sure. And if you were a pregnant woman, you were dead for sure. So what was that there was a gap in the age profile. There was a whole generation of elders wiped out. So new elders had to come into place before they'd finished their full education. There was also all the children under 5 had been wiped out. So there was a generational gap of women coming to marriageable age. And so because, as I said, because of the differential with more men than women, it ended up in elopement and wife stealing that caused intertribal conflict.
Interesting. Sorry.
People don't look at our history from an Aboriginal perspective. People don't say, well, how would have Aboriginal people responded to that? How did they think? We just assume, make European assumptions, Western assumptions.
The black armband view of history, according to John Howard.
Yeah. Well, John Howard was right in the sense when he said, why should we apologise? Because we haven't done anything. And if you take it in the sense that in the modern generation, we did not do anything. We're not responsible for the sins of fathers. And people don't think understood that that's what Howard was saying.
Kevin, go ahead.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jim, can we go back to Major Ross? Do you think in his mind what he was doing was genocide? And this following question after that is, was there any review back in Britain at any stage when Ross returned to Britain or anything like that? Was there any review of what had taken place? Was there any court-martial action taken against him?
What happened was Philip got rid of him and sent him to be governor of Norfolk Island. I think people had an inkling and didn't want to go any further. Now, the first thing that Ross did when he became governor of Norfolk Island is he doubled the amount of lashes that could be given from a prisoner from 100 to 200. That's the sort of guy he was. Then when he returned to England, they refused to confirm his rank as major, and he ended up dying in disgrace, I think, but it was never said. So I think they knew but didn't want to ask the questions. And that's continued to the present day. People don't want to ask the questions. As I said, people say to me, oh no, it couldn't have been that many, couldn't have spread all over Australia. People automatically try to minimise instead of, sort of facing it head on.
Well, do you think when he took the action that he did, do you think he was trying to kill the Aboriginal people as a race, or do you think he was trying to defend the colony in a proactive way, if you like?
Yes, well, that's the kindest way you could possibly put it. He knew what he was doing. He did not care for Aboriginal lives. He didn't care if they wiped them all out. It didn't matter. See, what the Lords of the Admiralty had placed him with powers over Phillip in the event of war, and they basically said, this is going to be a peaceful invasion or else. And Ross was the or else. And he knew what he was doing, and he didn't give a stuff. He didn't care if it killed every Aboriginal person in Australia.
Jim, can I ask a question? Here I am. Jim, is it a similar truth-telling commission being conducted in other states? I know Victoria is the first one. What are the plans throughout Australia so far?
No, there's each state, Australia as a country is a delegated authority from the 6 states. All the 6 states got together and said, we will give part of our sovereignty on defence, trade, all that sort of stuff to a federal government, to an Australian government. So in our constitutional arrangement, the federal government is a creature of the 6 states. Now, the 6 states can decide whatever they do. So Victoria is leading the way and saying, well, we're going to have a First Peoples Assembly, we're going to have a Truth and Justice Commission, and the other states will have a look and we'll see whether they follow suit or not.
Sure.
But the Australian government cannot direct the states in way on this issue.
So with the state's decision,
yes,
the people's decision for the state. Yes, thank you.
And if we develop a model in Victoria over the next few years, then the other states will find it easier to see what works and what doesn't work.
Elizabeth, Jo has had her hand up.
Yes, I'm just going to, Jo, go ahead. Oh, I didn't see it earlier, and I do apologise, Jo.
Sorry, no, that's right, because in a way it's not directly related. I'm a bit of a fan of Jim. I've read a lot of your leaflets and books and find them really interesting. I've just finished the one about sort of relationships and moieties and that kind of stuff. But two things. So one, I'm wondering why your name isn't bigger in the sort of academic side of Aboriginal history in this country. Is it because you are not actually an Indigenous person? And the other thing I'm interested in knowing is we've got some issues in Banyul where we need Aboriginal input on their permission or otherwise to do things. But I can imagine that there really are not very many of our Aboriginal elders to do this kind of thing. And how big a group are there? I mean, I think there was one of the people I remember meeting some years ago from the community who was a Wurundjeri man, lived down the peninsula somewhere or other. So they need some input on the treetops thing. We need some input from them on Greswell Hill and stuff like that. And they must surely be overworked. Is there a way we can support the Indigenous elders to be able to contribute to where we as Melburnians consider that there is sacred places and we want some input from them? Sorry, it's a long...
What you're saying, to answer your first question, I'm not a historian, so therefore I don't belong to the Historians Club. and they talk amongst themselves, and they have their own journals and things like that. So I'm a forensic investigator in a sense, and not a historian. So I don't have the penetration there. But in relation, you're exactly right with your summary of the situation. Aboriginal people in Victoria are only 1% of the population, and a lot of Aboriginal elders, there's just too few of them, but also in modern days there's a bit of protection of your own turf, and with some Aboriginal people, I'm a persona non grata, because I talk about my family's oral history, and I've known some famous Aboriginal elders, and I've been taken on country and shown things that most people don't, and shared things, and Aboriginal people, elders, have put their names to my books. But the Aboriginal organisations themselves and traditional owners organisations are very jealous of their turf and don't like white fellas poking their nose in. So the problem is that there's so much that needs to be done, and there's so few people that need to do it, that you can't, that the whole situation grinds to a halt, and you just can't get anywhere. So it's a very intractable problem, but you know, and we've just got to try and muddle our way through.
Sad. Thank you.
Kevin again. Kevin, go ahead.
Jim, what learnings has Victoria taken from the South African Truth and Justice Commission in terms of process? And
well, I don't see that the South African process can really work, because we're not talking about current, present day situations. When the Truth and Justice Commission and Desmond Tutu ran it, it was a reconciliatory process that that people could confess and say, look, I did this, and they wouldn't be prosecuted and thrown in jail. It was about reconciling people. But in the Victorian situation, we're talking about instances that happened 100, 150 years ago and all that sort of stuff. So, but we need to surface this sort of stuff. But we're also talking about the way in which disadvantage has been passed on to Aboriginal people. We know from the Closing the Gap programs that Aboriginal people have lesser education, have poorer health outcomes, all this sort of stuff. And we have, you know, institutionalized certain situations. These are the sort of things that we need to address. But as I said before, it's without the imputation of racial guilt. It's saying, look, Australia's greatest instrumental value is equal opportunity, which means that we should not allow any generation to have an accumulated disadvantage, that we need to have each generation. I mean, we parents want to give our children the best advantage as we can, and that's great, but it can't be at the disadvantage of other people in an institutional way. So we've got equal opportunity has to apply to each generation, and we have to ensure that Aboriginal people are given the opportunities to overcome the institutionalised disadvantages that they're still experiencing today. X.
Joe, I'm sorry, I've done something odd with my screen. Joe, did you have your hand up again? No.
Utah has, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes,
Jim, thank you very much for a most informative talk. I've learned quite a lot there. I have one question, and that is the book that's been written by Bruce Pascoe, dark emu. I found that fascinating. And I also found it very interesting that he got so much criticism from two historians who are very critical. Anyway, I was just wondering if you had an opinion on that, or whether, you know.
Yeah, no, look, it's very interesting what's happened, because a lot of what Bruce talked about, I knew about. Banjo Clark, 40 years ago, explained to me that Aboriginal people used to clear the hilltops of trees so that there could be grass seed farms on the tops of the hills. The kangaroos and emus wouldn't go up there because there was no shade or protection. And they managed the land. But what the mistake Bruce Pascoe did is that he went a step too far and talked about Aboriginal agriculture. I tend to use the term permaculture farming. When I was young, the story was told to me that an Aboriginal guy said to my great-great-grandfather, "Why do you white fellas build fences?" And he said, "Oh, to keep the animals in." And the reply was, "But if you make it how they like it, that's where they'll be." And that's Aboriginal people created all sorts of self-sustaining farms that didn't have fences. Australia, now, Bruce Pascoe went too far when he talked about agriculture, because we think of static agriculture in terms of European. Where they'd got to was a way of ensuring the productivity of the land, that nobody was ever in hunger in the worst season in 100 years. But it was permaculture farming. It wasn't agriculture. Now, there's conflated with that has been Bruce's claims to be Aboriginal and all that sort of stuff. But that most influenced me was Bill Gamage's book called The Biggest Estate on Earth. And he explained with great academic rigour how permaculture farming was conducted all over Australia. And but Bruce has made a valuable contribution, but has been pilloried by just taking that step too far.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
That's a good summary.
And any more hands there? More questions for Jim? Can I just ask another question? Jim, you may have covered it, but with regard to the smallpox, was that Australia-wide? Was that really in every state? Was there any state that was spared or?
No, all states. Now, I was able to pin down Aboriginal oral history references in every state except Western Australia. But in the second smallpox plague of 1828, it got to Western Australia. So there's no reason to assume that it didn't get to Western Australia the first time. It's just couldn't dig up any oral history, but logic dictates that it got all around Australia. Some famous Australians like Frank Fenner, who did the certification of the eradication of smallpox for the World Health Organization, he said, "Oh, smallpox didn't get to Victoria." And people just took it as read because he was a world expert, but he was absolutely, totally wrong. And I had a historian put to me that, it didn't get to Gippsland. Quite the contrary. Gippsland probably had it worse than anywhere else because it came from 3 different directions to Gippsland. And it was based on people's, when Augustus Robinson went through Gippsland in the 1840s, he didn't notice anybody with smallpox scars. So then the assumption was made, the smallpox didn't get there. Well, just because you didn't see anybody with scars, that's because they were all wiped out.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Mimo there? Mimo?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Jim, thanks very much for the story so far. How did you first get interested in this whole subject? What kind of drew you to it?
What do you mean, Aboriginal history generally?
Yeah, the whole subject that you've been talking about today.
Yeah. Well, my family first settled in the Yarra Valley in 1840, and my great-great-grandfather established close relationships with the local Aboriginal people, and he was one of only 2 settlers that I know of in the area that's learnt the Aboriginal language. Now, my great-grandfather grew up with Aboriginal playmates and friends and maintained lifelong Aboriginal relationships and continued, and family stories about him talking language to Aboriginal people when he was 80. There's all sorts of little stories passed down, which unfortunately, as a kid, I had a very retentive memory, and I remember all these stories. And it's only as an adult that I began to tease out the implications for these stories. Because just often history is passed down with little anecdotes. And when you start to then dig a little bit deeper, that you begin to and then talk to Aboriginal people. And when you talk to Aboriginal people, elders often speak in very metaphoric terms, and they're very economical with their language, and they'll say things and you'll think, what the hell was he talking about? And it took me about I was taken into the forest by Banjo Clark about 1980, and he said, I've just got to go into the forest and do some work. And what he was doing was cultural burning. It's now called mosaic pattern cold fire burning. He never explained a thing to me, but I watched, and I was just fascinated by what was going on. And it took me a long time to figure out actually what it was all about. And I've been lucky with the way in which I've been brought up and had Aboriginal friends and been trusted with, as I say, I've been taken places and shown things that most people never do. And I've just, as I said, I've got an ability to collect fluff and join dots up. And I join up dots that people often haven't done before.
Right. Yep. Good. Thank you.
Del. Yeah, Del.
So pleased that you collect fluff and join dots. One of the stories, it was just an aside really, that you made, that it was Aboriginal people who showed Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson the song line over the Blue Mountains. Are there any other stories like that you have of Aboriginal people actually helping Europeans that haven't been acknowledged?
Well, there's the first thing I think of. I read an account of somebody who went exploring up Queensland and had an Aboriginal friend with him, and he died. And so the Aboriginal friend brought him all the way back, quite a few hundred, brought his body back. Now, the explanation that was given in the history books was he brought his master back. But Aboriginal culture is about, Aboriginal people believe that your spirit belongs to the land on which you were born. So he knew that he had to take his friend, couldn't bury him in foreign land. And so therefore he took him all the way back to Sydney so he could be buried on his home country. Now, they don't think of thinking from an Aboriginal perspective. It was like, oh, he took his master back, like it was a duty to someone who owned him. So I constantly find, when I read Batman's diary of a supposed journey through Victoria, it was absolute rubbish, because they weren't thinking, well, what were the roles of the 7 Aboriginal guides and interpreters that were with him? It's like they weren't mentioned. What was the advice they gave him? And I read an account by William Barrack, and which contradicts everything that Batman said. And Barrack, basically said the Sydney blacks were sent out to make contact with the Yarra blacks, and they took them a couple of bags of potatoes. So, you know, I suppose I've got the advantage of when I read something, I'm thinking more from an Aboriginal perspective because I've been brought up with some understanding of how Aboriginal people think about country, you know, that sort of stuff.
Do you think the descendants, you know, the current Aboriginal people still think that what, you know, the old way?
Well, it's a bit of a mixture, like all things. See, colonisation is not just of the land, it's also of the mind. Aboriginal people were not just displaced, they were herded onto missions and they were made to worship the white man's God twice a day, not once a week, twice a day. So you get an inculcation of thinking, and also Aboriginal people were very diplomatic in the way in which they tried to phrase things to make it look like that Aboriginal thinking had parallels with Christianity. They realised that they had to dress up their natural religion. So Aboriginal people have adapted. Aboriginal people have also been brainwashed into thinking certain ways, but Aboriginal people still have a love of country and an understanding. See, when Aboriginal people were taken on country as young kids, you might be forced to go to church twice a day, but also when you're taken out onto country, your elders would tell you about the habits of certain animals and that. Like an Aboriginal person would say, see that tree there? Well, at a certain time of the year, insects will hatch in the bark of the tree, and then this particular type of bird will come to eat the insects, and that bird will build a nest in the tree and lay 3 eggs. And if you climb up the tree and take 1 egg, the bird will lay another egg to make up. But if you take 2 eggs, they'll abandon the nest and you'll get nothing. So they get taught all these little things. And so their love of country is still inculcated from an early age, but the overall philosophic framework or knowledge framework that it's embedded in has been lost.
How can we attach our grandchildren to that love of country?
Just by learning as much as you can from Aboriginal people and, you know, reading as well. But, you know, a lot of ordinary Australians, you know, have learnt to have a love of land like Aboriginal people. And Aboriginal culture and personality was shaped by the land and the dreaming. And we have been shaped by the land and the dreaming too. You have to have a certain laconic sense of humour, self-deprecation to be able to adjust in Australia. So Australians are gradually becoming more Aboriginal as time goes by.
Thank you.
Joe again? Yes, Joe, go ahead.
Can I just respond to Del there? You inculcate love of country by showing your enthusiasm for it yourself, not overdoing it, of course. And if kids go in cars, don't give them something else to watch. Make them look out the window when you're traveling and see the country and touch it, not watch the video. I've been on a school bus where we went on, you know, school camp. And the bus driver put on a video. So instead of looking at all the trees and the fields and everything on our way down to Venus Bay, they watched a bloody video. Sorry, one of my high horses.
I actually meant, you know, to know the details of nature, like the Aboriginal people did or do. Or
you have to learn it yourself and pass it on.
Yeah.
Read the books.
My children, I suppose, have been lucky that I've taken them to Aboriginal places with Aboriginal people and had holidays down at Lake Tyers and places like that. So they've had opportunities to talk to Aboriginal people, play with Aboriginal kids, and just absorb some knowledge. And say my younger daughter became a lawyer, and she worked in the Department of Justice, and she was the person who was able to get funding for the Koori court system. She put the whole idea forward and carried it through and got the funding, and that was $74 million. So part of her ability can be traced back, you know, to my great-great-grandfather's, you know, sort of involvement.
Elizabeth, Jutta has her hand up.
Elizabeth.
Hi, Jim, I've only recently, so in the last 3 or 4 years, become aware of the song lines. I've never heard of them before. Can you just tell us a bit more about them? I don't know if you're going to tell this to people who know everything about them. I'm just a bit more interested. Can you just give us a bit of an outline of what these song lines are?
Well, song lines are called song lines because just like the GPS in your car gives you directions saying turn left at the next intersection, turn right, blah, 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 Aboriginal people code the directions of travel into a song, which they sing as they're going along. They also have a practice called singing country, that everywhere they go, they're singing in praise of what they see, the birds swooping, the animals grazing. So all these major song lines are coded and sometimes celestially coded. Now, a few years ago, my wife and I were driving from Glen Innes to Byron Bay, and I said, crikey, this is a song line, because you can recognise it because they follow valley lines, ridge lines, easy contours and all that. And sure enough, when I checked it up, there was a song line, and they still had knowledge of the song, and the song line went from Yoo-rrook in Central Australia to Byron Bay. And the people used to travel from Byron Bay to Yoo-rrook to look at Yoo-rrook, and from Yoo-rrook to Byron Bay to look at to watch the sea and to see the dolphins herd fish, you know, with the Aboriginal people. So there's song lines that go everywhere. Now there's also Dreamtime pathways where there's creation stories attached to it. Look, song lines are everywhere. And of course, in your local area, you wouldn't necessarily need to sing the directions of travel because you know where you're going anyway. Everybody's just going up the street. But say like Heidelberg Road was a song line that went from Melbourne, you know, out to Greensborough, you know. Plenty Road was a song line. So if you think of all the roads that radiate out of Melbourne, if you think of for an aerial view, Geelong Road, Ballarat Road, Calder Freeway, Sydney Road, Plenty Road, Heidelberg Road, Maroondah Highway, Dandenong Road, Nepean Highway were all Aboriginal song lines. And you know, people travelled all over Australia and traded goods and using these song lines.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mimo again. Yes, Mimo, go ahead.
Jim, coming from an art background, I'm sort of curious to know what your ideas and thoughts are about the way Western, the Western Australians, Western as in Western culture, have in some ways influenced that rebirth, what has been called as the rebirth of Aboriginal art, you know, by giving them materials and so on. First, was it the late 60s, 70s, 80s? So that's one group of art that's sort of come out, and it's created some great artwork. And then there is, I'm aware of current contemporary Aboriginal artists, like I'll mention 3 or 4 names, maybe you've heard of them: Brooke Andrews, Reka Rennie, Richard Bell in Queensland, Ricky Maynard in photographer in Tassie. What do you think of the impact of these two kind of quite separate approaches to Aboriginals making art?
Well, Western culture is representational by and large. You know, if you forget cubism and things like that.
Yeah.
So, and Albert Namatjira in the 60s painted landscapes and that sort of stuff. And as Aboriginal people gained access to acrylic paints and things like that, they began to adapt traditional motifs and whatnot to the European materials. But basically, I look at it, Aboriginal people tend to have two perspectives when they paint. First, they tend to paint from a bird's eye view. And if you show an Aboriginal person an aerial map of the country, they immediately can tell exactly where, you know, everything is, because they have that aerial view. And the second thing that Aboriginal people do is they paint what the mind knows, not just what the eye sees. So if you want to do a drawing of a dog, you can draw their intestines and whatnot as well. You know, if you draw a river, you draw the currents of the river and the, you know, where the currents where it changes at the water holes or whatever have you. So it's what the mind knows as well as what the eye sees, and the bird's eye view. And a lot of Aboriginal art has become a sort of ritualized to what sells best as well. It's not just, you know, sometimes it represents a traditional story, but sometimes I've seen Aboriginal art which is just representation of a motif, a series of water holes, for instance, and it's not a map as such. It's just a representation of a design of several water holes, which is pleasing to the eye. So there's market adaptation going on as well as representation of traditional thinking.
And is this a good thing or a bad thing, do you think?
It's neither good nor bad. You know, if art is pleasing to the eye and an Aboriginal person is earning an income by doing it, you know, then I suppose it has to be a good thing. In that, you know, what we have to do is create economic opportunities for Aboriginal people to not only participate in ordinary Australian society, but to help the rest of us participate and share our Aboriginal heritage. So if that gives, and Aboriginal people love jobs in land care and things like that, and if jobs in art and whatnot can advance people economically, that's fine.
Thank you. Yep.
Oh, Dale.
Now that we're opening up, Jim, are you going to be taking any group talks around Templestowe or maybe through Yarranderran or any places like that?
Always available to give talks, and I think with the experiences we've had with Zoom and recording these sorts of things, you know, is good. What the organisation I belong to, Reconciliation Manningham, we have a website which we're trying to redevelop, but getting access to the expertise that we need is difficult. But there's a lot of educational materials. All you've got to do is Google Reconciliation Manningham and look at the articles or whatever, you know, just there's for instance, a potted of some 60 articles I've put together. It's called Readings in Australian History, the History You Were Never Taught. And a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today is in a series of articles, those 60 odd articles that are put together there. But also we're planning to do presentations like this today to have on there. So we also have started a Facebook page, and we have regular posts a couple of times a week. So all you've got to do is Google Reconciliation Manningham Facebook, and that will get you onto a lot of you know, small, you know, pieces of educational material that, you know, is of topical use. And one of the things we do is on this day, you know, whatever the, for instance, I think on the 23rd, was the anniversary of Banjo Clark's birth 99 years ago, and Banjo Clark is just an amazing person. So we did a little bit on him. Historical events, so you just Google Reconciliation Manningham Facebook and you'll see regular events coming up on the page.
Well, I think it's just getting on for 11:15 here. I think it remains to say, Jim, on behalf of the UCA, many thanks for sharing your knowledge with us and for having this discussion with us this morning. I've certainly learned a lot in the last hour or so, and I'm sure I can speak for just as many others. It's a start, isn't it? And we move forward within Victoria. So once again, thank you. Thank you so much for coming along and giving your time to talk to us this morning. Thank you.
Not a problem.